It's lovely to be here. Well, I can see we have quite a few people already, 54, which is fantastic. My name's Jim. I'm one of the trainers for Cambridge Press and Assessment. I'm based in Spain. I'm not based in Germany, but I hope that everyone, I can see that we've got people from all over, actually. Also another person from Spain, which is fantastic. It's really lovely to be here because we're focusing on a topic that you know, over many years of working with teachers, grammar is something that always comes up. And we always think about the teaching element of grammar and not about the assessment element of grammar. And I'm hoping that by the end of this webinar, and it is going to be a webinar in which I'm going to ask you to do a few things. So be ready with your keypads and your mouses to engage in some activities. Because hopefully we can highlight how the teaching and an assessment need to be combined for grammar instruction to really be effective. So I'm going to move through. If at any stage you have any issues seeing the slides, please let us know in the chat. I can see that everyone said hello, so we all know about the chat. Just to recap what Brigitte was saying there, they're doing the first webinar, but there will be two more. These are the dates here. Our next one is focusing on Lexis or vocabulary development, and then we have developing speaking competence through assessment as well, which will be taking place in December. So, before we begin, we have two underlying principles that we're going to be operating under or considering as we move through today's webinar. In fact, these underlying principles tie into all three of the webinars in this series. And the first one is looking at this idea of what's called communicative competence. Now, it would be fantastic in the chat box if you could just say a yes or a no if you've heard of this before. If you've seen this term somewhere, or perhaps you're quite familiar with it, or if you've never seen this term at all, okay? All right, I'm seeing lots of yeses. This is fantastic. Okay, we've got a few no's, some yeses. All right, fantastic. So communicative competence, what is communicative competence? Now, communicative competence is a concept that's been around for quite a while. It was put forward by Cannon and Swain in the 1980s, and it's gone through various iterations, and this here was the first one. And we're operating from this one because it's probably the simplest in terms, but it's also the most widely used within research and assessment. It's not actually a research framework, though. What it is it's trying to conceptualize how communication occurs. And you see there down the bottom that there are three elements that go into being a competent communicator. So we have grammatical competence, and this actually covers quite a lot of ground. This looks at grammar, lexis, everything that's language related falls into this ability. Really, we need to have some knowledge about language in order to be able to be competent in communication. Next, we have social linguistic competence, and this is our understanding of the context in which we are and how appropriate this language is going to be. So do we understand the context, and do we understand how to use that language in that context? And then we have strategic competence, and this is looking at the strategies that we use in these situations that link to not only how we communicate, but also how we might work around some of the things that we don't know how to say. Okay, so we're looking at our compensatory strategies as well. Now, this is a very, very simple explanation of communicative competence, but it is an important underlying principle that we're going to keep in mind throughout these three webinars. Now, there is another one that's going to be very important. This is called integrated learning and assessment. And again, in the chat box, a yes or a no if you've heard of this term before. Integrated learning and assessment. Okay, we've got a yes, a no. Okay, I see more no's for this one, and that's actually probably to be expected, because this is an approach to teaching that Cambridge we've conceptualized over the last probably year. So this has been out for about a year now, and it's nothing new. It's what teachers have been doing for a while, but we've conceptualized it in an approach that looks at teaching, learning, and assessment together. Okay, and there are four pillars: learning objectives, evidence of progress, actionable feedback, and tailored follow-up. We know from research that these four elements here form the foundation of effective teaching in the classroom. And there's elements of this that tie into a whole range of different aspects of the language teaching organization, from management to creating classes and looking at curriculum design. But we're thinking for the classroom today, right? Now, we're not here to explain this, but when we look at one of the later sections in today, this is going to be important because we have to remember that as teachers, we're really thinking about the learners at the end of the day. And if we don't keep the learners in mind when we're assessing something, and if we don't keep the data in mind that we collect from this assessment, then we're probably doing our classes a disservice. Now, today, when we're looking at these ideas, are going to tie into this idea of how can we use this data that we're collecting from our learners to provide actionable feedback and tailored follow-up. We're going to be focusing on those last two areas mainly. So a brief overview of this webinar. We're going to be looking at grammar. What is it? And interestingly, I ask teachers all the time, what do you define as grammar? It's actually more of a difficult question to answer than we think. So we'll come to that. We're also going to be looking at how we might assess learners' knowledge of grammar. So we'll come to some ideas there. And then we're going to think about the classroom application of this. Once we've collected this data, what do we do with it? Yeah. Now, by the end of today, this is our success criteria. I'm hoping that as a result of the session, you feel more comfortable using assessment practices to assess learners' grammatical knowledge, and then use this, so this is the most important part here, use this data effectively to impact the second language learning journey. But before we begin, and this is where I want you to use the text, the chat box, yeah? Okay, so I have 4 statements here. I want you to think about, when you read these statements, what are your initial thoughts? Okay, so I'm going to read the statements aloud and you can think and then write at the same time, right? Number 1, I am knowing the answer. 2, he the book read. 3, she ain't got no money. 4, the data shows that we will be rich soon. So I'm going to give everyone about a minute or so to think about, when you look at some of these, what initially comes to your mind? Yeah, I don't want to give anyone the answers or put words in your mouth, as I would say if we were together. But I'm going to give you a second to think about it. And feel free to add some comments in the chat box. Oh, look at that. We're at 63 people now. That's fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at the chat box. I'm going to say some of the things that I'm seeing. Okay, so Andrea said communication ideas comes through despite lack of correct grammatical structure. Interesting that we've used the word correct there. This is going to come up quite interestingly, I think. Okay. Oh, Ursula, you've actually pointed us out. I wasn't going to mention this, but it ties into this actually. The coining of "I'm loving it," that chain of aspect, right? Normally we wouldn't say "I'm loving it." Okay, we would say "I love it," right? Very, very interesting. Interference from the first language. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Understandable, but I like that. Okay. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for sharing. I can see that lots of people are going there. Unfortunately, I don't have time to read out all of them, but we are going to return to these points, to these statements, if you will, or these issues with language after the next section. So let's think about this question. If you had to define grammar, if you were put on the spot and there's a person that says, right, define grammar for me, what would you say? Now, if you feel comfortable putting something in the chat box, fantastic. If you don't, just think on it, right? I'll give everyone 20 seconds, 30 seconds to think, and then we're going to take a look at a definition, or maybe multiple definitions. We'll come to that. Excuse me. Okay. So Bete has said the structure of language, system, a tool for communicating with others, grammar structures, meaning. Okay. So Sean's given us a bit of a metaphor here. If language is cooking food, then grammar is the recipe. Oh, I like that. Okay. So I wonder where vocabulary fits in that. Interesting. Okay, we'll come back to that after, or perhaps in our next webinar. So Kathy said standardized use of language structures for successful communication. Yeah, that's a really interesting word there. Standardized. I'm going to take note of that. And if we have time, we'll come back to that later. Standardized. Standardized. Very interesting that that's came up. Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your suggestions. Let's take a look at some perspectives on what grammar is. Now, we're going to look at some perspective, but at the end of the day, we also need to have another question in mind. Why should we assess learners' knowledge of it? That's why we're here today, right? So we as teachers know that grammar is important to some extent, and we're here because we feel like, oh, I need to be able to assess it to do something with that data. But the why, I think we can tie to this that pedagogical objective of helping them get better. And that's great, but that's quite broad. And depending on how we assess learners' grammatical knowledge, maybe that objective changes. But we'll come to that a bit later. Let's look at the what. So some perspectives on what grammar is. And you may want to just not take notes, but think of these different definitions, how they tie into what you wrote. So we have what's called universal grammar. Now, universal grammar is a theory of how first languages are generally acquired, but it ties into second language as well. And it's basically this theory that says that we have an innate set of linguistic principles that basically defines the language that we produce, okay, based on the input that we hear. And so this is related to first language acquisition generally. Another perspective of what grammar is looking at syntax and morphology. Okay, so we've got things like syntax, where we look at the structure, okay, and then we've got morphology and how things fall together, okay. We often teach things like this, like so we look at like the chunks of language and so on and so forth, okay, like, or present simple, right, looking at syntax and morphology around that, or we think about affixes, prefixes, suffixes. This falls into this idea of syntax and morphology. And this is generally what people think about when they think about grammar. But let's go a little bit further, because we're here today to go deeper. We also have what's called descriptive and prescriptive grammar. So descriptive looks at an objective account of how people actually use language. So many of us here may be familiar with things like corpora or bodies of words, and we can use them to analyze how people use language. This is looking at descriptive uses of language, right? But then we have the prescriptivists. Prescriptive grammar. This is where we say, this is how language should be used. Now, I'm not sure about, for example, in German, but we definitely have prescriptivists in English. Some of them are definitely language teachers. We often have a very clear perspective of how language should be used. Okay, and we can see elements of this in actually in many countries and with many languages around the world. Okay, Spain has the Real Academia, and then we obviously have France. They have a very strong linguistic focus on the prescriptive use of French. Okay, so these are different perspectives that we need to take into account. Now, then we have what's called rule learning, and we have item learning. So what's the difference here? Rule learning, it's a little bit counterintuitive because we think of rules as things like present simple or the conditional structures, whatever they might be, right? But rule learning actually connects to second language acquisition, and this is focusing on what's called interlanguage. And interlanguage is a fancy word for the brain and how language is stored in the brain. And basically, your interlanguage, the language that you have in that second language, it develops over time. It gets better. It gets more. It gets closer to the target language. That's what we like to say. Now, rule learning is when your brain is going through these cognitive processes and working out how these structures work together and how these patterns govern what you should be producing or how you should be interacting with that second language. And it's a very, very complex, implicit process. Implicit meaning that we can't really see it. Yeah. Then we have item learning, and this is where probably most of language teaching focuses on. This is where we're trying to memorize specific language chunks or phrases or forms. We are looking at McNuggets, as Scott Thornberry would say, of grammar, where we might look at things like the present perfect, conditional structures, relative clauses, pronouns, and we're teaching them to learners, and we're asking them to memorize them. So we've got, again, some different perspectives on what grammar is. Now, the question here is, which of these perspectives do we take into account as language teachers? Let's revisit our structures that we had before. Now, I've got them on the screen so you can read them, but I'm going to go through a few of these things and how they tie into those points of grammar that we had before. So, well, at the first sentence there, I am knowing the answer. Most of us probably said, well, that's wrong. Okay, we have the wrong aspect is used with the progressive tense there. However, we also know that within Indian English, okay, which is not a standardized version of English when we're thinking about kind of British English or American English, okay, but it is a variant of English that is, millions of people speak it, okay? Indian English, and this is from their first language acquisition, okay? So this is completely appropriate in that context, and this is something that's frequently used. The second one, he, the book, read. Okay, so there's definitely a clear issue here, and this ties to this idea of syntax, and it could be tying to morphology as well if the present tense was trying to be used. So he reads the book. Okay, so there could be the third person S there missing as well. All right. The third statement, or the third language point there, she ain't got no money. Okay, now, I can remember when I was a child, my mother saying, you can't use ain't. Ain't a word, is what she would say. However, again, this is looking at that prescriptive view of language. But this is actually completely fine from a descriptive use point of view, right? And then we have the last one there. The data shows that we will be rich soon. Very, very interesting here, because here we have what's called language change. We have grammar itself is changing. Data as a plural noun or a singular noun is acceptable now. So which one do we use? Data is or data are? It's interesting because I write a lot and I submit my manuscripts for revision, and I get lots of different feedback from different people. Some people say data is, some people say data are. But when we look at how it's used, we see that both are used. So very, very interesting here, looking at this perspective of what is grammar. And it's not an easy question to answer, but having a knowledge of these points here are going to make our decisions around assessment with grammar more informed. So we come to that question of why assess learners' grammatical knowledge. And there are probably three main reasons. So whatever perspective of grammar that we look at, and we're going to look at two specific ones in a moment, but we'll get to this in a sec. There are probably three. The first one is awareness and diagnostic purposes. And this ties in very closely to what we do as teachers. We need to be aware of what our learners know or what they can do with language. Very important. We're going to come back to that point. And how that's going to influence teaching, right? So I'm diagnosing what they know or that they don't know so that I can choose to do something later. We also have this element of what's called washback. And this term washback, in effect, it means that the test or the exam is influencing what is teaching, what is being taught. So with that in mind, if we have a test that has grammar on it, even if we're not interested in grammar learning, we're still going to be teaching grammar explicitly because we need to prepare our learners for that test. So this is washback. But then we also might test learners' awareness of grammar or their ability to use grammar because we've been teaching it and we want to evaluate our teaching to see how successful we've been. Another element of teaching that is very important, that is often overlooked in the learning process. But here comes the most important question. Can we actually assess learners' grammatical knowledge? And you're probably all thinking, well, of course we can, Jim. Yes, it's very easy. We just give them a grammar test and we can test. Yes, but the answer is not so clear-cut, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to look at why. So the reason here is we go back to those two perspectives that we looked at last, and they were rule learning and item learning. Now, rule learning, when our interlanguage finally acquires this rule, whatever it might be, learners can then use that language spontaneously. Okay, and that there is the objective of much of our work as language teachers, is to be able to, for our learners to be able to use language spontaneously in the moment, whether it's spoken production or written production, but also to understand things from listening and reading texts. There are some interesting things here that we know from a wealth of research over the past 50 years. This implicit knowledge, which is what they're using in this spontaneous use of language, is almost impossible for us to assess. Almost impossible. It's very difficult for us to identify where someone is in this interlanguage development, especially in the classroom. It's very difficult to do in a research context. However, generally, when we're looking at working with understanding where someone is, we rely on what's called focus on form or corrective feedback. And we take an account of what learners are saying or the errors that they're making reactively. Okay? We'll kind of come back to this point when we look at some ways in which we can assess. But then we have item learning. And if we remember, item learning is when we're looking at those chunks of language that we're teaching prescriptively. We're saying, okay, today we're going to learn the present perfect. So we're looking at the present perfect, and we want them to understand what it is and memorize it. Now, this is what's called developing declarative knowledge, their knowledge of the language, not necessarily their knowledge to use the language, but their knowledge of the language. Now, this, it's much easier to assess. We can assess this, okay, because it's related to memory, in effect. However, we need to think about this. What are we assessing and why are we assessing? If we're trying to assess declarative knowledge, we can do that. But does that mean that learners can actually use that language in spontaneous communication? Not necessarily. So maybe we need to also think about how we can assess that underlying competence in grammar as well. And this is where it becomes a little bit difficult, right? How do we do both of these things? At the end of the day, we need to keep that idea of communicative competence in mind. There is research that shows that declarative knowledge can be useful when we're interacting with text. And so it's important for us to assess that. But it's also very important for us to assess learners' ability to use grammar communicatively, spontaneously. And we need to think about interesting and innovative ways in which we can do that, because moving away from the standard grammar test is our step in the right direction. But you're thinking, oh, Jim, give me some answers. How can we do that? Well, this is what we're going to have a look at in the next part. So far, we've seen, or we've defined grammar. Let's say that. And we've seen that there are various definitions that we can keep in mind. And then we've thought about the why of assessing it and connecting that to communicative competence. Now, we're going to do an activity here. Now, what I would like you to do on a piece of paper in front of you is you have a paragraph on the screen. I'd like you to translate this paragraph into your first language. If your first language is English, choose a second language, okay? So I'm going to give everyone a minute to do this. I know that's not a lot of time. 1 minute, just on a piece of paper, to translate your sentence, the paragraph into your first language or a second language, if your first language is English. And also, it'd be interesting to get your perspective. Pineapple on pizza is acceptable or not acceptable? So Edith says not acceptable. Edith, I don't think we can be friends. Pineapple on pizza is totally acceptable and a must in certain contexts. But I digress. You have about 30 seconds more to translate your paragraph. It's a bit of a trick question, yes. Svenja said that in Sweden you have banana pizza. That, I don't know where. I think we need to draw the line somewhere. Although banana pizza, I mean, now that I'm thinking about it, banana, like grilled banana with like some honey maybe. Could be good. Interesting. Okay. I'm not going to judge. Not yet. Not yet. All right. So hopefully you've had time to engage in this activity. This translated paragraph that you have, I want you to put to the side. We're not going to think about it for now. So at the moment, you have a different version or in a different language of the paragraph that you can see. So let's think about how we can assess learners' grammatical knowledge. Now, we're going to look at 4 ideas in this next section. Test, teach, test, which if for those of us that have been around for a very long time, we've probably seen many times. Focus tasks, gap fill or close, and error identification. Let's get into it. So, test, teach, test. Now, I want us to look at this example here. So this is taken from one of our course books from Cambridge. We have here a presentation of a grammatical structure. Yeah. Then we have the next part where we're getting learners to use this grammatical structure in a very, very controlled manner. So we have presentation, practice, yes. And then we have an extension of that, but still supported. So we've got the presentation, we've got controlled practice, and then we have what might be called semi-controlled practice. They're still not free, but we're giving them some semi-controlled practice. Yeah. And then last, we have the production stage where learners are trying to use this grammar spontaneously or in a task that requires them to use it some way. Correct? Okay. Now, we're probably all very familiar with this framework, PPP. It's been around since, for a very, very long time. However, we do know that this approach is not the most effective for effective teaching of grammar. There's one thing that we can do, however, when we're working with this approach to make it better. And that is by doing the last part first. So let's think about this. We've got the final practice element that we did at the end, but we're going to do it first. And you're asking yourself, why, Jim? Learners are not going to be able to do this. Yeah. But this is the point. If we don't understand how our learners can do this task with this grammar or this language point in mind, how are we going to teach them effectively? If we move straight into presenting them the grammar, then we don't actually collect any diagnostic information about their level of knowledge with that point. Secondly, if we give them the task to do with the language point and they can't do it, it gives learners a clear indication of why they are there, why we are here today in this lesson. So, and tying onto that is at the end of the lesson when they can do that task, that discussion point, that written task, whatever it might be with those grammatical points in mind successfully, they get a much more clearer, visible indicator of progress with grammar within that same lesson. So there's a really, really good reason for us to use test, teach, test with grammar in mind. The main one being that diagnostic purposes. If we get learners to do the activity and they can use that structure relatively well, is there a reason for us to prescriptively teach it? No. We can move on to something else, something more complex. Maybe we look at some emergent language that has come out of that discussion. However, if many of our learners are struggling to use those grammatical items that we're hoping that they're using that task there, then that gives us the impetus to say, yep, this is what we're focusing on today. So this is test, teach, test. This is number 1. Let's have a look at number 2, focused tasks. Now, focused tasks are defined as those tasks in which they naturally elicit certain grammatical structures. So let's take a look at this task on the screen here. And this is taken from one of our courses. The task is work in small groups, tell each other about your favorite film families, and decide together which one is the best. My question for you, and we'll see how wild the chat goes now, what grammatical structures might this task elicit? So if we did this with our learners and I just got them to engage in this discussion task, what types of grammar structures would you expect them to produce, do you think? Okay, we've got simple present, yeah. Like plus gerund, okay, yeah, definitely. Okay, it's clear to see that we are a room of language teachers, which is fantastic. Okay, everyone has come to the right place. Here are some suggestions. Yeah, but it could be many, many, many different things here. Okay, depending on how we focus this task, how we guide that output. Now, focus tasks are fantastic. They do the same thing that we said before with test, teach, test. They give us that idea if learners can naturally, spontaneously use those grammatical structures that we have in mind without telling them to do it. This is the important thing here, because what we're looking at here in these first two, test, teach, test, and focus tasks, is we're trying to give them an opportunity to use that language spontaneously. And this is tying into what we spoke about, that rule learning, that interlanguage. Are they able to use that spontaneously? And this is the difficult thing for us to assess. However, with these tasks, we take more than one step to getting closer to be able to assess that natural, spontaneous language use. But let's shift now. Let's shift to the declarative knowledge. Let's shift to their explicit knowledge of specific grammatical structures. There are two elements here that we're going to look at. This one is probably the most famous activity that we have all done as learners and as teachers, that we've probably given to our learners. And this is the classic gap fill, the close activity. Now, we have two versions of these that are quite useful for assessing declarative knowledge. You can see here in the screen that we have the gap fill, which is guided. So you have a clue, and then the learner needs to work with this clue and the grammatical structure in mind to complete the gap. And this is less complex. It gives them a lot of support. And in fact, it's probably more of a pedagogical guide. What we can do when we're looking at really assessing their knowledge, and this is taken from one of our exams, okay, is we can remove those clues, those hints. And this is where we look at a more natural gap or gap fill or close, is where we get them to complete these gaps without any assistance. Now, this can also be targeted. So one of the best ways that you can do this is by choosing a text that has a specific grammatical structure repeated many times, and you remove that grammatical structure. A classic example here is looking at articles. The article system in English is quite complex compared to other languages. So removing a and the, and then seeing how learners go in their ability to complete this task without prompting them what to use. Okay, so we're not giving them too much information about what they need to use. They need to see what naturally comes to their mind. This can actually give us a lot of really, really interesting information about what we're going to be focusing on. Right, all of my learners, they can use with these specific nouns appropriately, but there is causing some interesting difficulties there. So let's focus on that. So Edith has said, if you think English articles are difficult, try teaching German. Do you know that many years ago, I was thinking about learning German, and someone at the time, I think it was another teacher, he said to me, life is too short to learn German. Now, of course, that's not true, but it is something that has always stayed in my mind. So I'm sure that there are many more complexities as well, perhaps at a grammatical level in German. Right, moving on. So we've looked at gap fill and the close. But another really, really useful tool for us as language teachers is error identification. And this ties into this, especially the reason for assessing when we're trying to assess how well learners have actually learned what we focused on. And this is where we can do this. We can do this randomly, or we can do this targeted. And this is where we give learners a range of different sentences and they have to correct them. If you're looking to do this really, really well, you would have multiple errors, grammatical errors in the same sentence, and you don't tell learners how many mistakes there are. So this is where we're looking at that natural thing. However, if we're trying to focus on making it as learner-friendly as possible, you may want to give them some hints. Again, there's no one rule here. What's clear about all of these four that we've looked at is that there are certain reasons for assessing, and we need to choose these types of assessments based on what we're trying to assess. Now, error identification, as I mentioned, is great for after a learning period, but the others might come in that diagnostic period or to raise learners' awareness of what they don't know. So we looked at 4 ideas, and these were the assessment practices. Now, you probably think, well, they're not really game-changing. They're not super innovative. And the reality is we don't need to have lots of innovative things. The 2 that you should be focusing on, though, as language teachers, predominantly are the first 2, where we're looking at test, teach, test, and focus tasks. These here have so much utility in the language classroom. However, we often rely on tests that look at only declarative knowledge, not on spontaneous grammatical knowledge. And I understand there are contextual variables that come into play here. Lots of learners, lots of different levels. However, this is where we can collect the most information, but also show our learners where they can improve really, really easily. Now, fantastic. We've chosen our tool, but what are we going to do once we have all of this data? We've got this information. We said, okay, they don't know the present continuous for this use, for example. Well, now we're going to look at the teaching element, and this ties into what we mentioned at the start of today, the second underlying principle of this webinar series. Looking at learning objectives, evidence of progress, actionable feedback, and tailored follow-up. Actionable feedback and tailored follow-up is what we're focusing on now. We've collected the evidence of progress. We've collected evidence of how they're doing with specific grammatical structures. Now we need to provide feedback, and now we need to provide that tailored follow-up. So let's look at some ideas of how we might work with that data. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to aid learners in noticing. Now, noticing is a process that our brain goes through when we notice what we are saying or producing and how this is different to the target language structure. So this is what we might call the correct version, and this is what I am saying or writing. And now I can see the difference from this. We need activities that help learners notice the gap. Lots of research in second language acquisition says that this gap cannot be closed if learners don't notice that gap. Okay, so there's a really, really strong rationale for engaging in this assessment and follow-up activities. So I have a question for us before we go on. Should teachers provide feedback on errors in the moment, after the activity, or not at all? Okay, I'm going to give everyone 20 seconds to think about this, and then I want you to write some ideas in the chat box while I connect my charger. All right. Okay, so let's take a look at the chat box. All right, so there's the people that have been, they've played the it depends card. It depends, it depends. It does depend, right? So you are right, it does depend. But if you had to choose, generally, let's say the majority of the time in your classes when learners are engaging in speaking tasks or writing tasks, all right, so it seems, if I'm reading correctly, that most of us feel like after the activity. Okay, we've got a few that said no, a few that said perhaps in the moment, not sure. All right, let's explore this question. Now, this is a quote taken from Brailovsky and Mackey, a fantastic book, if you ever have the chance to read it, The Art and Science of Language Teaching. And they say, to master new grammatical features, research shows that learners need to first pay attention to these forms when they come across them in the input, e.g. in the written text or spoken conversation. What they are referring to here, and this aligns with almost 30 to 40 years of research on corrective feedback, is that the most effective corrective feedback is in the moment. Now, that for us sparks many questions. Why should we do it in the moment? Are learners not going to be fed up with us interrupting them? Now, there's lots of research on that as well. Most research indicates that learners want to be corrected, number one. Two, most of research has found that when done appropriately, targeted, with care in mind for our learners' emotions, there's no negative impact on performance or engagement with the class. So there is a huge rationale for us to engage in corrective feedback, especially because this is how this ties into this element of noticing, which is going to help learners develop that grammatical competence with whatever point that we've corrected them on. Now, you might be thinking, well, how do we do that? And of course, many of us know what we're doing. Intuitively, we've got these techniques that we go through. And there is definitely value in correcting errors after the task. However, just a point on that, if we are correcting after the task, it's really important that we give learners an opportunity to repeat the task and try to use those language features effectively again. Sorry, I've got lots of gas today coming up. I don't know why. I had a sandwich before and it seems to be coming up. Right, so let's think about oral corrective feedback. And it does change a little bit for written corrective feedback, but we're going to focus on oral corrective feedback at the moment. Now, in the literature, we have two terms. We have indirect and direct. Now, I don't like those terms because they don't really tell us what is going on. What I prefer is more learner work and less learner work. So this is the spectrum that we're looking at here. So let's take a look at what's going on here and some ways in which we can work with learners and how this ties into grammatical knowledge increasing. So when we have less learner work at the bottom here, we've got explaining why the error needs to be corrected and providing the correct form. This is where, as teachers, we are saying, this is wrong, this is the rule, this is what you need to say it. Yeah? And then we have more learner work, and this is where we have things like feigning misunderstandings. What did you say there? I didn't quite get you there. Okay, so we've got this spectrum here of different techniques, and what we've seen from research. In fact, most of the research has actually been conducted on what are called recasts, and those, depending on how they're received, are that repetition of the error. So we repeat the error or we provide the correct error. So as you can see there, providing the correct form. I have been to America, generally with an emphasis there. Now, just because lots of research has been conducted on this doesn't mean that they are the most effective. Generally, what we found and what is recommended from researchers in this area is that we need to use a range of different types of oral corrective feedback techniques here. Only using one, only focusing in the morning or only after the activity is not going to be the best approach. So to summarize here, we need to be taking a more holistic approach and trying to use as many of these as possible without forgetting to correct in the moment, because this is when learners are psycholinguistically ready for that feedback. Now, for those of you that are interested, we do have a white paper on this called Giving Feedback to Language Learners that explores this in a little bit more detail. Okay, this is freely available online. Let's look at another activity. So we focused on aid learners in noticing, and the noticing occurs through corrective feedback. We're helping them see, okay, they've made a mistake here, they can get to the next part. But let's think about another activity that's more something that we can plan. Now, this is called dictogloss or text reconstruction. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to play an audio, and what you need to do is listen to the recording, but you're not supposed to write anything while you're listening. Okay. Now, I know that some of you are going to cheat, you're going to write, but that's okay. Yeah. Now, when we finish the recording, then you have to write from what you remember. You have to try to reconstruct the text. Now, I'm just taking a look at the time. I don't think we'll have time for this, and also because we are in the online dynamic, we can't really do the next part, which is where you get the to reconstruct. Now, just to give us an example of this, all right, you would listen, you would write notes after you've stopped listening, and then you would join with a partner and think, okay, we've got these notes. How do we build this into what was said? And here we're really focusing on meaning. But let's analyze. Now, I was going to use 10 years ago. I was going to use this text, okay? And I'll show you why in a moment, because you see here, we were focusing on specific, so used to be, I used to, I didn't used to. Okay, so the grammatical structure that we were focusing on here was used to. Now, the reason that we have focused on this is ideally from my assessment before, I've identified that learners they were struggling with used to. Okay, maybe they weren't using it correctly, or maybe they weren't conjugating correctly in the tense, whatever it might be. Yeah, but let's assess in this activity that learners we're getting learners to do. So first thing, learners are working together to collaboratively reconstruct a text meaning. They probably won't remember everything exactly. The idea is not for them to remember everything exactly. The idea for them is to use all of those internal processes and their notes to try to reconstruct their an accurate, okay, because we do want it to be as accurate as possible from a meaning perspective, an accurate representation of what was said. Now, during this process, learners engage in what's called languaging. And languaging is this idea of, let's talk about this language. Do I put an S here? Does the ED go there? Does this word go with this word correctly? So languaging is when learners are talking about the language themselves. They're, in effect, giving each other feedback on how that language is being used. So this is student-directed, not teacher-directed. And there's a lot of evidence to highlight that this is actually really good for increasing that noticing that we spoke about before, yeah? Increasing the amount of time, the amount of moments that learners get to notice what is different in their output compared to what it should be for the target language. Now, ideally here, we're giving, as teachers, we're giving learners time to negotiate meaning. They are working together and they're trying to negotiate things together. We can assist, we can help them out, but we want them to try and work this through. And as I mentioned before, ideally the dictogloss, it can be used just within, for example, as a paragraph from a text that learners have read as a follow-on activity. But ideally in our case, we're using this with grammatical structures that we know that our learners have struggled with before. And this, again, from more research, is basically highlighting that languaging is a key element in that internalization of grammatical concepts. So changing that interlanguage and how learners are able to use that language spontaneously, which is the ultimate goal of grammar instruction. Now, we don't have time to explore this in detail, but I often ask teachers, should we use the first language in the classroom? So I'm going to ask you now, and I just want you to give me a yes or a no. You can't say it depends. I just want you to, it's a binary choice here. So we've got a yes or a no. Let's see what we've got in the chat box. Okay, so we've got some people that are saying yes, 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 yes. Okay. Oh, there's an interesting point there. So Monica said yes if it's a monolingual classroom. That's actually a really, really good point. Really, really good point. Yeah. All right, so I think the majority of us have said yes, some of us said no. Let's explore what we mean here. I want you to go back to the paragraph that you translated before, okay? Now, I want you to translate it back into English. Back into English. Maybe the first sentence if you didn't get the whole thing. Translate it back into English. Now, what you're doing here, and what you would be doing if this was a classroom, is that you would have an individual time to translate your paragraph back into English. And then you would have some time to share your retranslation with your peers. And effectively, we are, okay, so this was the actual version here. Effectively, we're engaging in more languaging. But I have a question. When we look at this paragraph, what do you think was the grammatical point that I had in mind when we were moving through this activity? Any ideas? I'll give you about 5 seconds more, see if we've got any ideas of what could have been the grammatical structure that I was focusing on. I'm going to highlight them in a sec. 3, 2, all right. Okay, so these were the things that were in focus. So here we're looking at kind of countable and uncountable nouns. Okay, so this is the focus of this activity. Now, when we analyze what's happened here, again, we've been focusing on more languaging, but we've done something very, very important. We've created a cognitive scaffold. We've allowed them to use their L1 in the first process, and we're leveraging that in the second process, in that languaging process. Now, this is what we might call an appropriate use of the first language. And what we're not saying is that learners need to be using the first language all the time. That's definitely not what we're trying to say here. However, there are specific moments, and there's research that backs this up, that highlights that the first language can be beneficial if used appropriately. In fact, we have we also have a white paper on this if you're interested in exploring it. Okay, so we've come to the end of that section there. And just in this session, I know we've got about 6 minutes left, which is great because we want to have time for our raffle at the end as well. We've defined grammar, and we've seen that it's quite a complex area. We've looked at 4 ways in which we can explore learners' grammatical knowledge. And of course, we've identified what we can do with that data once we've collected. So we looked at noticing, we looked at dictogloss or text reconstruction, and we focused lastly there on that L1, leveraging their one in L1 retranslation activities. All of these designed around pieces of grammar that our learners have struggled with previously in those tests that we've assessed. But let's engage for the next 3 minutes or so in some reflection. Now, on the screen, you will see that you have a QR code, okay, which you can scan with your phone, or in the chat box, I'm going to put a link. Let's see if this works. And what I'd like you to do is answer one of the questions. Okay, so on the Padlet, we've got a few questions that you can choose to answer. We don't have a lot of time, so we've only got about 3 minutes left because we want to have some time for raffle. I know that everyone's very keen for looking at who's going to get Raymond Murphy's, a signed copy of Raymond Murphy's fantastic book. Now, we've got a few questions that you could answer. What are your 3 key takeaways? It doesn't have to be 3. What are your key takeaways from this session? Was there anything interesting or an idea that you thought, yeah, I would like to try that? I am going to give you a summary handout as well with all of the ideas that you can take away, because I know that, we probably weren't taking notes. That's fine. You might also choose to answer the second question. What are 2 points from the session you found interesting? Or what is one question you have about assessing grammar with communicative competence in mind? Maybe there's something that we didn't answer, or there's something that you would like to explore further. And also, we have a feedback question. It's just a question, really, just to get an idea of some feedback on your satisfaction levels with this webinar. This webinar, quite short, quite direct, but hopefully it's provided some ideas in this area. So I'm going to be quiet for the next 2 minutes. I'm going to take a look at the Padlet screen. I'm going to give everyone about 2 minutes to write something, write some thoughts. And of course, if you haven't finished writing something in the next 2 minutes, then you can keep that page open and return to it once we finish. Okay, so I'm just going to be quiet for 2 minutes, and then we'll return to finish up, hand over the summary, and then I'll hand over to Brigitte when we look at the raffle. Okay, just taking a look at some of the comments. I need more time to think about this. Very interesting. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you so much for everyone commenting so far. Hartmut, I'm sorry to hear that you missed the talk. I assume that there was some audio issues on your side. Was that correct? Okay. So it's a bit too fast, some of you have said, or one person has said there. No time to think about anything. Yeah. I apologize if we were going a bit fast. We did have a lot to cover, but we'll take that into consideration for our next ones to try and create a few more moments, perhaps some reflection moments throughout. So we have about 1 more minute, and then we're going to come back and go through the final component before I hand over to Brigitte. Like I said, as I mentioned, feel free to keep that page open, provide your comments or your feedback there. I'm going to go through that, and we'll actually have this as an artifact for this webinar series, because so this will tie in, and that will be shared with the CLET team, and that'll be made available to everyone later. Okay. So I did promise some resources. Now we have lots of lovely resources in this area. we are going to be looking at Raymond Murphy's English Grammar in Use, but there are a whole range of different resources when we're looking at this idea of assessing grammar and exploring this idea of integrated learning assessment with grammar in mind. Some really interesting things here for you to take away. Looking at the Integrated Learning and Assessment Ideas Pack, we actually have a pack of activities. There are 30 activities that you can use in your classroom, which tie into the Integrated Learning and Assessment Framework, which looks at this idea of using the power of assessment to impact learning positively. And we also have a lovely webinar from Scott Thornbury that looks at grammar and looks at those really interesting questions there as well. So I'm going to give all of these to you in this summary handout. So feel free to scan the QR code for this, and then you can receive this. I'm going to get you to scan this, but I also know that Brigitte is going to be sending out this summary in the automatic email, which will follow up this session. Okay, so I'm not going to share the link in the moment, but if you want to scan this, you will also receive this in the PDF format following the session. So I'm going to stop there. I want to say thank you so much for everyone. A super quick hour. The hour went very, very quickly. Brigitte, I'm going to hand over to you, and then we'll move on with the raffle. So thank you very much.